My daughter-in-law said I was just free childcare, so I packed my bags and took the one thing they needed most. I was folding little Paula's shirts in the living room that night, smoothing each sleeve the way my mother once smoothed mine. The house smelled faintly of reheated pasta, and the vanilla candle bell always lit when guests came over, but never for us. I held one of Paula's tiny shirts against my cheek, feeling its softness, feeling her warmth still trapped in the cotton, and I kissed it without thinking. Moments like that were the only quiet pieces of joy I had left in this house. I heard their voices before I even straightened my back. They drifted from the kitchen, sharp, careless voices, meant only for each other, never for the woman who had sacrificed everything for the boy now laughing at her expense. Belle said it first, her tone dipped in vinegar. Honestly, is there anyone more pathetic than your mother, Paul? She is almost 70 and still standing behind a register, scanning groceries like her life depends on it. That woman smells like coins, like pocket change. She does not know anything about family, just receipts and cash drawers. Paul chuckled, the same laugh he used when he wanted to impress people. She is used to it. My entire childhood she was running off to work. If you forced her to stay home with us, she would probably have lost her mind. The shirt slipped a little in my hands, my fingers trembled, and I closed my eyes. I did not want to hear more, but their voices kept flowing through the hallway like a cold draft I could not shut out. Belle scoffed again. And the only reason she lives here now is because she has nowhere else to go. Cashiers do not retire. They just keep standing there until their legs give out. If she gets sick, we will end up paying for everything. We might as well prepare ourselves. Paul hummed, as if that made sense, as if he had not grown up on the very money those tired legs earned. Belle's voice turned crueler. She has exactly one purpose in this house: free childcare. That is her value. I would not trust her with anything else. Who respects someone like that out in the world? I bit my lip until I tasted iron. My hand loosened, and Paula's shirt slipped from my grasp and fell soundlessly to the carpet. I stared at it. The tiny pink flowers printed across the fabric. That shirt once made me cry from joy when Belle allowed me to buy it with my employee discount. Now I could barely breathe. If you feel justice deserves celebration, smash that hype button. Let us keep stories like this alive, echoing far, far away. Your support helps us bring understanding and love to those who deserve it. Thank you so much. Keep listening. I pressed my palm against the wall because my knees weakened, not from age but from the weight of a truth I had avoided for years. This was not the first time they had spoken about me like this. But tonight, something twisted differently inside me. Something cracked in a place that had already been worn thin. I leaned closer to the doorway, not because I wanted more pain, but because the next words felt like a blow I needed to let land properly, so I would never forget it. Paul said, "Honestly, babe, I do not think she even cares about us. She cared about her money. She always smelled like the store. When I was a kid, she came home exhausted, and I swear she hugged the cash register more than she hugged me. That is probably the reason I never learned what real affection feels like." Belle replied with a soft, satisfied sigh. "Do not worry. Paula has me. I am not letting her be raised by the same cold woman who raised you. I can feel it. Your mother keeps trying to make Paula love her more. I do not like that energy." Energy. That was the word she used for the arms that had carried Paul through fevers, for the hands that had counted every last dollar to buy groceries so he would never know hunger, for the voice that read him stories until 3 a.m. after my third shift at the store. Energy. As if everything I had done was some dark force instead of love. I felt something inside me fold shut like a receipt drawer slamming closed. Belle clicked her tongue. If she disappeared tomorrow, honestly, the only thing we would miss is the free babysitting. Though even then, we could always hire someone better. Paul let out a low laugh. True, at least a babysitter would listen. Mom never listened. That was what broke me. Not the insult, not the mockery of my job, but the lie that I had never listened. I had listened to every cry, every fear, every whispered dream Paul had. I had listened so hard I forgot the sound of my own needs. But standing there behind the wall, my hand pressed flat against the paint, I understood something simple and sharp. I could listen to them, But I no longer had to stay. I bent down slowly, picked up Paula's shirt, and held it to my chest. Not to comfort myself, but to remind myself who I was still fighting for. Because if their words had taught me anything tonight, it was this. They did not see me as a mother. They saw me as labor. And labor, eventually, walks away. People think resentment is born from cruelty, but sometimes it grows from misunderstandings that no one bothered to clear. When I think back on Paul's childhood, I see him through windows fogged by exhaustion. I was always running, always working, always scrambling to keep the lights on and the water warm. His father died when Paul was 7, struck by a drunk driver on his way home from a late shift. Overnight, our little house felt twice as empty, twice as cold, and everything that needed doing fell on my shoulders. I did not have the luxury of grieving. I had a child to raise, and grief does not pay for groceries. I became a full-time cashier, picking up every shift that opened, even the ones no one wanted. Morning shifts, late shifts, shifts that bled into one another until my body forgot how to rest. At night, after the store closed, I cleaned the stockroom for a few extra dollars. I wiped down dusty metal shelves while Paul slept alone at home, his father gone, his mother gone to work, the house too quiet to comfort him. When I came home, the faint smell of old receipts and coins clung to my clothes. It was the smell of survival, but to Paul, it was the smell of abandonment. He grew up seeing me in the same uniform, the same sagging shoes, the same barcode scanner marks on my wrists. He would climb onto my lap asking why I was always tired, and I would stroke his hair and tell him, "Because you deserve more than what we have." But that was not what he heard. He heard, "Because I never stop working." Children translate love with different dictionaries. I remember school events. Every time the calendar came home in his backpack, my heart twisted. I wanted to go. God knows I wanted to go. But every time I asked for time off, the managers looked at me like I was requesting a trip to Europe. "We are short-staffed," they would say. "We need you, Tatiana." I was a widow. I needed that job. So many nights, I told myself, next time, next event, next month, until the next never came. One night stands out more painfully than the rest. Paul was 10, rehearsing for his class performance. He asked me, almost whispering, if I could come. He did not get his hopes up, but I saw the tiny spark in his eyes. I promised him I would be there, no matter what. I promised. That evening, the store called. Someone called in sick. "We need you." I stared at the phone, then at the mirror. My uniform hung beside me like a sentence I had to serve. I chose work. I chose the job. I chose money, at least. That is how Paul remembers it. In my memory, I chose the roof above our heads. When he stood on stage the next day, the seat I said I would fill remained empty. I learned later he scanned the audience over and over, hoping the door would creak open. When it did not, something inside him shifted forever. That empty chair became a symbol he never forgot. In his mind, I had chosen the cash register over him. In my mind, I had chosen to keep us alive. Two truths can exist at once, but a child only believes the version that hurts. As Paul grew older, his resentment grew with him. His grades were average, his confidence thin as tissue, and every failure piled back onto the altar of that missing childhood affection. When he did not get into the college he wanted, he blamed himself first, then life, then quietly, privately, me. When he ended up working an ordinary office job, he looked at my worn uniform and saw his future reflected in it. He hated that image. He hated what my life represented: hard work without glory, responsibility without applause, survival without celebration. Every time I sat at the kitchen table counting quarters from my tip jar to make rent or buy him cleats for soccer, his face tightened. To me, those coins were blessings. To him, they were proof that he came from nothing. Proof that he belonged to the world of people who scraped by instead of people who rose above. Then came Belle. She swept into his life like someone who had never worked a late shift in her life. She came from a family that measured worth by bank accounts and vacations, not character. She hated humble beginnings. She hated anything that reminded her of the struggle she never had to know. When she met me, she smiled politely, but I saw her eyes flick over my shoes, my old coat, the creases in my hands that years of scanning items had carved. It did not take long before she began rewriting Paul's childhood, drip by drip. "It was not your fault," she whispered to him. "Your mother did not know how to love you. When you wanted a hug, she was counting money. When you needed her, she was thinking about bills. She is the reason you grew up feeling small." Paul believed her. She gave him a villain, and he grabbed it with both hands. It felt easier to blame me than to sit with the loneliness he carried. She told him he had been emotionally neglected. She told him love should look effortless. She told him struggle was a choice weak people made, and he believed that too. Soon he began seeing me through Belle's eyes. Every sacrifice I made became a failure. Every shift I worked became proof I loved money more than him. When I worked 3 jobs, I was greedy. When I finally retired and moved in with them, I was a burden. In his story, I had never been a mother trying her best. I had been a cashier trying to survive, and somehow, surviving made me unlovable. Every morning, before the sun even bothered to rise, I would hear the soft thump of Paula's feet on the hallway floor. She always came to my door first, never her parents. I would sit up, open my arms, and she would crawl into my lap, her cheek warm against my neck. I dressed her, braided her hair, and made her the same oatmeal I used to make for Paul, thinner now, because Belle said she worried about Paula's weight. I packed Paula's little lunchbox, wrote a note with a sticker, and walked her to the car with her tiny hand wrapped around my finger. Those moments were the only time I felt like a grandmother instead of an inconvenience. When we came home from the preschool drop-off, the real work began. I swept the crumbs from last night's dinner, scrubbed the pan, Belle burned and abandoned in the sink, wiped the fingerprints from the glass table, and started the laundry. Belle liked white sheets, but never considered how much bleach cost, or how heavy wet linens were for my aging arms. I washed Paula's clothes separately, because Belle insisted her daughter needed a different detergent, not the cheap kind you use. Around 10, I would start preparing dinner, chopping onions and peeling carrots while my knees ached from standing too long. By noon, I was hanging clothes outside, rubbing at stains, folding towels in neat stacks. Belle walked through the living room during one of these chores, glanced at me with the same expression people give a malfunctioning vending machine, and said, "Mais sont de la de l'âme vieille, confie d'un idiome." She said it casually, as if reminding me of my job description. I nodded, because after enough humiliation, nodding becomes easier than speaking. One afternoon, while I was wiping the table, Paula toddled toward me with open arms. "Nana," she squealed, her whole face lit like a sunrise. Before I could reach her, Belle swooped in, grabbed her by the wrist, and pulled her back. "Do not hug her so close, sweetheart," she said sharply. "Your grandmother smells like the supermarket." Paula's little smile trembled, and she looked at me with confusion, as if she could not understand why a hug had suddenly turned into something forbidden. I swallowed that moment, like I swallowed so many before it, letting it burn its way down. Dinner was the worst part of the day. I cooked, set the table, served the plates, and stood by the stove while the 3 of them ate together. Belle always filled Paul's plate first, then Paula's, then her own. She never once looked at me when she said, "Mother, you can eat after the kitchen is clean. We will only make a mess if you sit down now." Paul did not protest. He never protested. He chewed in silence while I quietly gathered empty cups, wiped splatters from the counter, and pretended not to hear the scrape of forks or the laughter that was never extended to me. Sometimes Paula tried to save a tiny piece of chicken for me, but Belle would scold her. "Eat that. Do not give your food away. You need it more than she does." I would smile at Paula so she would not feel guilty, but I could feel my dignity thinning like tissue paper. One evening, my chest tightened while stirring the pot, and a cough escaped me, one of those deep, lingering coughs old workers get from cold grocery store aisles, and years spent lifting more than they should. I steadied myself against the counter. "Today I am a little tired," I said softly. "Can I rest from watching Paula tonight?" "Just tonight." I asked it timidly, like a child asking for permission, though it was my old bones that were trembling. Belle turned to me, eyes cold. "No, Absolutely not. You live here to watch Paula for free. If you do not do it, we have to hire someone. Do you know how much a babysitter costs? Who do you think will pay for that? She spoke as though I was asking to borrow money, not just a moment of rest. Paul did not look at me. He kept staring at his phone, scrolling through something more important than his mother's exhaustion. In that moment, something inside me faltered. Not broke brakes or sharp and sudden, but sagged inward, like an old beam that had been carrying too much weight for too long. I looked at Paula, who reached her small hand toward me from her high chair, chocolate smeared on her chin, whispering, "Nana, tired?" The concern on her little face made my eyes sting. I walked over, gently wiped her mouth, and whispered, "Nana is okay." It was not true, but lying felt kinder than letting her see me hurt. As I carried the dishes to the sink, Belle's voice carried down the hall again. "If she is too tired to work, maybe she does not need to stay here at all." Paul made a noise of agreement, quiet but unmistakable. They did not know I heard. They did not know I always heard. And with every word, every dismissal, every command disguised as kindness, I felt myself shrinking, not from age, but from the realization that in this house, love was a transaction, and I was the only one paying. People think power reveals itself loudly, but sometimes it sits quietly in a drawer, waiting for the day someone finally remembers it exists. In my case, it lived inside a thin manila folder I kept tucked behind Paula's birth certificate. I used to take it out at night, just to remind myself I was not as powerless as Paul and Belle believed. I did not enjoy the feeling. I simply needed to remember that I had not imagined it, that once in my life a system had looked at me and said, "You are the safest person in this child's world." When Paula was born, Belle's world collapsed. She had always wanted motherhood as an accessory, something to post online, to display at brunch, to talk about when she wanted sympathy or applause. But she was not prepared for the screaming, the sleeplessness, the weight of a tiny human who demanded real affection. After 3 weeks, she spiraled. One afternoon she was in the nursery, rocking Paula to a new song she wanted to film for her followers. When the camera slipped from her hand, she nearly dropped Paula trying to catch it. A nurse visiting that day saw everything. Within hours, a hospital social worker entered the room and said that Belle needed temporary monitoring. Paul sat beside her, nodding, overwhelmed. And while Belle sobbed about losing control, the social worker placed a stack of papers in front of them and said gently, "This is a temporary guardianship agreement. Nothing dramatic. Just someone trustworthy, helping to stabilize the environment." She turned to me. "Mrs. Tatiana, we recommend you." Belle cried harder. Paul rubbed her back. Both of them signed without reading a single page. In their minds, it was just another form, another thing to rush through so they could go home. They never asked what it truly meant, but I read every line. It said that in any situation in which the child's safety could be questioned, the temporary guardian me had the legal right to act. They did not care then. They care now, but the signatures are still theirs. Months later, another suggestion came, this time from the pediatrician. Install cameras around the home where Paula spent most of her time. It was not surveillance, it was supposed to be protection. Just in case, he said. Belle and Paul nodded eagerly, imagining it would make them look responsible. They bought a set of cameras online and installed them, one in the playroom, one in the hallway, one near the living room where Paula often napped. They assumed I was too old to understand how any of it worked. I heard Paul whisper one evening, "Mom will not even notice them. She can barely use her phone." Belle laughed like it was the funniest joke she had heard all week. But I noticed. I noticed everything. I noticed the light blink when Belle set up her ring light and filmed herself talking about postpartum empowerment, while Paula cried in the corner of the playpen. She cried for 11 minutes straight. I counted every second. Belle never turned around, never paused the recording. She kept talking about resilience and self-love while her own daughter sobbed behind her. I noticed the tilt of Paul's shoulders when he shouted at Paula each time she spilled a cup or dropped a toy. One morning, she knocked her cereal bowl over and milk splattered across the table. Paul slammed his fist down. "You are just like your grandmother," he snapped. "Clumsy and useless." Paula flinched so hard the spoon fell from her tiny hand. I had to bite my tongue until it nearly bled, because if I spoke then, I would have screamed. I noticed their whispered conversations at night, too. I walked past the hallway once and heard Belle say, "If she died tomorrow, we would save hundreds a month. Do you realize that?" Paul muttered something like agreement. I do not think he meant it the way she did, but the words existed. They were spoken, and I felt them like cold fingers along my spine. One afternoon, while packing Paula's bag for preschool, I reached into my purse and accidentally spilled a handful of quarters onto the floor. I bent down to gather them, embarrassed, even though no one should have seen. But Paul stood by the doorway and scoffed. "Mom has lived her whole life in pennies and quarters," he said. "No wonder she acts small. People like her never learn to be anything else. People like her. People like me, his mother." He spoke as if my entire worth could be calculated at a checkout line, as if decades of late shifts and sore feet were proof I had failed him. As if my sacrifices were a joke he no longer found entertaining. But the camera above the bookshelf did not laugh. It blinked quietly, watching, recording everything, every insult, every dismissal, every moment they proved exactly why the social worker had handed me that manila folder in the first place. Paul and Belle thought the cameras were decoration. They thought the paperwork was meaningless. They thought age meant ignorance and kindness meant weakness. But I was beginning to understand something. In a house where cruelty was loud and constant, silent power could be the sharpest weapon of all. And soon, they would learn exactly how much I had heard, and exactly how much I had the right to do. Winter nights in this house always felt colder than they should have. Maybe it was the draft slipping under the doors, or maybe it was the way silence sharpened after everyone went to bed. That night, the cold felt different. Paula lay in her little bed, her skin burning against my palm, as though a fever was trying to claw its way out of her body. When the thermometer blinked red 104 degrees Fahrenheit, my chest tightened in a way that was far too familiar from the old grocery freezer aisles. Her breaths came quick and shallow. Her eyelids fluttered. Her fingers curled against my hand like she was holding on to something slipping away. "Sweetheart," I whispered, brushing her forehead. "Stay with Nana." She did not stir. Panic thumped in my ribs, but panic never helped any child. I did everything I knew. Cool cloth, gentle tapping, lifting her head slightly, but nothing made a difference. I felt her heat rising, pulsing through her tiny frame. I wrapped her in a blanket and lifted her into my arms. I hurried down the hallway, the floor creaking beneath my feet, and knocked hard on Paul and Belle's bedroom door. "Paul," I called, my voice cracking. "Open the door, please now." After a moment of irritated shuffling, the door swung open. Paul blinked at me with the anger of someone who had been pulled from a warm bed. His hair was messy, his eyes unfocused, and annoyance sat on his face like an uninvited guest. "What?" he snapped. "What is going on?" I was asleep. I held Paula closer, trying to keep my voice calm. "Paula is burning up. Her fever is very high. We should take her to the hospital. I am worried she is not responding." Belle sat upright on the bed, arms crossed, looking at me like I had interrupted a royal ceremony. "Children get fevers all the time," she said, rolling her eyes. "You are being dramatic again. You always do this, make everything bigger than it is to look important." I stepped further into the room so they could see Paula clearly. Her cheeks were flushed bright red, her hair damp with sweat, her little body trembling. "She needs help," I whispered. "Look at her." Paula opened her eyes just enough to murmur, "Nana," before her head sagged against my shoulder. My heart twisted. Paul sighed, as though exhausted by my existence. "Mom, go back to your room. You are scaring her. And stop acting like the world is ending. You used to make a scene every time we were short on money. This is just the same thing. Always the drama." "It is not about money," I said, desperate now. "This is her health. Please, Paul. She is very sick." But he waved his hand at me like brushing off dust. "You always think you know more than everyone else. You did this when I was a kid too. Always panicking, always overreacting. Just go." He stepped forward, his arm brushing mine, and pushed at my hand as if trying to take Paula, but the sudden movement made me wobble. My back hit the doorframe, and I nearly lost my grip on her. The blanket slipped sideways, exposing her burning skin to the cold air. My knees weakened, and a bolt of pain shot up my spine. The camera in the corner of their room blinked quietly, capturing everything. Paul's voice rose, sharp and cutting. "If anything happens to her tonight," he shouted, "I will drag you through court until you have nothing left. Do you hear me? I will take every cent you have. Do not touch my daughter again." Paula let out a thin, terrified wail, clutching at my sweater. "Nana, I am scared." Her voice hoarse, small. Pleading was the only truth in the room. Belle looked away, annoyed. Paul crossed his arms, refusing to see what was happening right in front of him. For a moment, I could not breathe. Not because of the shove, not because of the threat, but because I realized I was completely alone in protecting this child. The people who should have cared the most cared the least. I tightened my arms around Paula. Something cold and solid settled in my chest, the way resolve sometimes replaces heartbreak. I turned away from them without another word. If they would not help her, I would. I carried Paula downstairs, her fever radiating through the blanket, and grabbed my phone with trembling hands. When the 911 operator answered, I could barely speak. All I managed was, "My granddaughter, she cannot breathe right, please come." The sirens arrived faster than I expected, filling the street with an urgent, pulsing light. The paramedics moved efficiently, asking questions, checking vitals, placing tiny sensors on Paula's chest. "Good call," one of them said. "This fever is dangerous." They lifted her onto the stretcher, and I held her hand until the last moment before following them to the ambulance. I looked back at the house, no lights, no movement, no parents rushing out. Paul and Belle never asked where she was going. Their anger mattered more than their daughter's life. As I climbed beside barely conscious Paula, one truth settled in me. Tonight, everything broke, and nothing would ever return to what it was. At the hospital, everything moved quickly, nurses pushing machines, alarms beeping, voices firm but calm. I stood in the corner holding my breath while they worked on Paula, cooling her body, giving her medicine, placing a small oxygen mask over her trembling lips. When the doctor finally came to me, rubbing his tired eyes, he said softly, "If you had waited any longer, she could have gone into a seizure. You did the right thing by calling us." His words were meant to comfort me, but they hollowed out my chest instead. Right thing or not, I had been the only one who cared enough to act. Paula slept peacefully after the fever broke, her lashes damp, her tiny hand curled on the white blanket like she had just won a battle without ever knowing she was in one. I sat down in the hallway, the hard plastic chair pressing into my spine, and watched the slow rise and fall of her chest through the open door. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by a crushing wave of something else memory. My husband had smelled of metal and oil from the auto shop, a scent that clung to his jacket and hair long after he came home. He worked until his hands cracked, until grease settled beneath his nails in lines so deep they looked like part of him. We never had much, but we had enough to laugh, enough to keep going. Sometimes, after counting the week's bills, he would squeeze my hand and say, "We are poor now, Tia, but our child will not be, and our grandchild will not even know what poor feels like." I used to laugh, thinking he dreamed too far ahead, but he meant every word. We saved everything: coins in jars, crumpled bills in envelopes, tax returns tucked into a hidden account. He took extra jobs fixing neighbors' cars, pushing past exhaustion, because he believed in a future better than our present. When he died, every jar, account, and investment became mine. The house he bought before our marriage, the mountain cabin he secretly restored, the investment portfolio he built with a mechanic's precision, and the trust fund meant for the grandchild he never met. Paul knew none of it. He only saw me counting change at the kitchen table and assumed that was all I had. I let him believe it. I wore old coats, paid my own way, and tolerated jokes about smelling like money. I stayed silent because Paul carried deep shame about our poverty. Knowing the truth would have turned that shame into blame. Belle would have used the money like a weapon, manipulating Paula as leverage. I saw her greed long before she saw my worth. So I hid everything because love, to me, was sacrifice. But sitting in that hallway watching Paula breathe after her parents ignored her cries, I understood. My silence was no longer protecting her, it was protecting them. My husband once told me, money should shield the innocent, not enable the careless. I finally understood what he meant. The trust fund, the houses, the investments, they were never meant to cushion Paul's irresponsibility or Belle's cruelty. They were meant for a child who deserved safety, opportunity, and love. For the first time since my husband died, I felt something fierce rise in me. My silence had been love, yes, but now that silence could become something else entirely. A weapon, a shield, a lifeline, and I knew exactly whose side I was on. Paula recovered slowly, her fever settling into a soft warmth instead of the raging fire it had been. The nurses smiled at her bravery, and one of them touched my shoulder after checking her vitals. "You saved her," she said gently. "If you had waited even half an hour, she might have seized." I nodded, but the words did not comfort me. They only confirmed what I already knew. In that house, my granddaughter was an afterthought. When the hospital processed the paperwork, everything pointed back to me. I was the one listed as her emergency contact. I was the one whose insurance information covered her care. And when the social worker looked into the file, the temporary guardianship agreement still bore my name, Tatiana, right next to Paul's and Belle's signatures. No one questioned why. No one hesitated. The system simply recognized what it had recognized years ago. I was the safest adult in Paula's life. When the doctor finally released her, Paula held my fingers with quiet trust. Her little voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Nana? Home?" she murmured, and I knew exactly which home she meant because it was no longer Paul's. The next morning, before the sun lifted its head, I began packing. Not much, just what mattered. My old clothes, the soft ones that smelled faintly of detergent, and years of holding a child. A small box of photographs, Paul as a baby, with flour on his cheeks, Paul learning to ride a bike, Paul hugging his father the year before he died. I lifted the box gently, my hands trembling not from age but from the ache of remembering who he used to be. Then, I placed Paula's favorite stuffed bear on top, a small, faded brown cub she had named Bumble. She never slept without it. I placed everything into 2 bags, one for me, one for Paula. Then I wrote a note, tucked it into a white envelope, and set it in the center of the kitchen table. Inside the envelope were copies of every document they had forgotten existed. The temporary guardianship form, the pediatrician's earlier recommendations, and the medical report from the night of Paula's fever. I added a short message: "She is safe, and until the court says otherwise, she is with me." When I walked out of that house with Paula's hand in mine, there was no fear in my steps, just certainty. We drove straight to the cabin my husband left behind, a quiet place surrounded by pine trees, where the air smelled clean and the world felt far away from cruelty. At noon, Paul and Belle returned home. They must have sensed something wrong the moment they stepped through the door. The house was too quiet. Paula's shoes were missing from the mat. The stuffed toys in the living room were gone. And the envelope lay open on the table, its papers spread out like cold truths. Paul's voice cracked first. She took her. Belle, she took Paula. Mom kidnapped our daughter." Belle grabbed the papers with shaking hands. "This is nothing. This is not real." Then her face twisted when she recognized the signatures on the guardianship agreement. "She tricked us. She must have tricked us." Paul ran in circles, frantic, shouting incoherent threats. Belle grabbed her phone. "I am calling the police. That old woman is insane." When the officers arrived, they listened calmly, far too calmly for Belle's liking. They read each document, flipping through pages with practiced eyes. They watched the hospital report. They watched the camera footage that showed Paul pushing me with Paula in my arms. They watched Belle, ignoring Paula's cries to fix her makeup in the reflection of the TV. Finally, one officer closed the folder and looked at them with a composed, unshakable expression. "According to the documents you signed," he said, "Mrs. Tatiana has temporary guardianship. That authorization has not expired. She had the legal right to remove the child if she believed the home environment was unsafe. And based on the evidence here," he tapped the camera footage, "her concerns were justified." Paul staggered backward. No, this is wrong. She is just a cashier. She does not know anything about the law." Belle shrieked. "She cannot do this. She is a broke old woman. How can she have any authority?" But the officers were unmoved. "She followed the law," one said plainly. "And you, Mrs. Bell, and you, Mr. Paul, from what I see here, you will need to explain your behavior to family court." As their voices rose in disbelief and indignation, an email pinged on Paul's phone. He opened it, expecting relief. Instead, he read words that made his face go pale. According to the terms of the trust fund established by the late Mr. Tatiana is the sole trustee and has exclusive authority over all financial resources designated for Paula's education, health care, and long-term well-being. No expenses regarding Paula may be approved without her written consent. They lost their babysitter. They lost their daughter. They lost the money they assumed would one day be theirs. And worst of all, they lost the polished image of a loving family they displayed so proudly online. Meanwhile, as their world unraveled, Paula slept peacefully in the mountain cabin, curled against me with Bumble tucked beneath her arm, safe, warm, and finally, far from harm. The court hearing took place 3 weeks after I left their house. By then, the mountain air had already softened Paula's cheeks, and her laughter came easier, like she knew she no longer had to hold her breath around the people who were supposed to love her. I braided her hair that morning and told her she would only need to play with toys in a quiet room nearby while Nana talked to some grown-ups. She kissed my cheek and said, "I be brave," and she was. Paul and Belle arrived at the courthouse with a kind of frantic confidence, the kind desperate people wear when they still believe they can charm their way out of consequences. Belle even wore a white dress, as if purity could be sewn into fabric. Paul looked tired, anxious, and angry all at once. They filed their petition accusing me of kidnapping, elder instability, and emotional manipulation. Their words cut, but the truth cut deeper. My lawyer stood calmly, opening a folder filled with the evidence they had created themselves. The judge, a woman who looked like she had seen every kind of human lie, listened without blinking. First came the footage, the camera in their bedroom showing Paul shoving me while I held Paula, the way my body lurched backward, the blanket slipping, Paula's terrified cry. Then the audio clips, Belle snapping at Paula to stop crying while she live-streamed, Paul calling his daughter useless, and both of them discussing how my death would save them money. When the doctor's statement was read, Paula's fever, the medical danger, the life-threatening delay, Belle's eyes widened like she had forgotten any of it happened. Paul looked down, twisting his fingers. Then my lawyer placed one more document on the table, the guardianship paper with their signatures. The judge lifted it, studied it, then looked at them over her glasses. "So let me be clear," she said. "You two called this woman a money-obsessed, freeloading cashier. Yet she is the only person who brought your child to the hospital, paid the bill, and possessed the legal authority to act. Everything she did protected Paula. Everything you did endangered her." The silence in the courtroom felt like winter settling into bone. Belle opened her mouth, but the judge raised a hand. "Do not interrupt." Her voice turned firm, colder than any insult they had ever thrown at me. "This court appoints Tatiana as Paula's primary guardian for the next 18 months. After that, the court will reevaluate. Until then, both parents may visit only under supervision. Given your conduct, you will also attend mandatory parenting classes, therapy, and a course on elder abuse." Belle gasped as if slapped. Paul's shoulders collapsed inward. "And understand this," the judge added. "Any violation of this order will result in immediate removal of your parental rights." "Do I make myself clear?" Paul nodded, eyes wet. Belle remained frozen, fury twisting her face into something sharp and brittle. After the ruling, the hallway outside the courtroom felt too bright. Paul approached me slowly, as though walking toward a memory he barely recognized. "Met," he whispered. His voice cracked around the word. I thought you never loved me. I hated the smell of your uniform, the clinking of coins in your pockets. I thought you chose work over me. I never understood you were trying to keep us alive." I looked at him, and for the first time in years, he looked like the little boy who used to fall asleep on my chest. But I would not let nostalgia erase the truth. I answered gently but firmly. The night you stood on stage looking for me, I was scanning groceries for strangers so I could afford the shoes you wanted. I am sorry I was not there, truly. But I never chose money instead of you. I chose responsibility. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I did not know. I did not see it. Belle made sure you did not, I said. Belle stiffened as I turned toward her. Color rose on her cheeks, anger, embarrassment, or the sudden realization that her cruelty was now public record. Maybe all three. You said I only knew the smell of money, I told her quietly. But you were willing to let Paula cry alone so you could record yourself for strangers online, and you judged my life while offering nothing to this child but neglect. Belle opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Then I spoke the words that had waited decades inside me, heavy but necessary. You both said I spent my life with small money, with small things. But those small things built a future for you. Those small coins bought the home you grew up in, bought the food you ate, bought time until your father's paycheck arrived. And those small things, every penny, every sore bone, every late shift, became the foundation of a future you were never grateful for. I stepped closer, my voice steady. And now, those same small things, every dollar I saved, will give Paula a life you have not earned. They looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. Not as a burden, not as a cashier, not as free childcare, but as a woman who had survived more than they had ever known. In the months that followed, Paula and I lived peacefully in the mountain cabin. I planted flowers outside the porch, sunflowers that grew taller than both of us. We cooked together, read stories together, and walked the winding trail to the small school nearby. Her laughter filled the house the way warmth fills a cold room. The trust fund remained untouched except for her needs alone. Not for Paul, not for Belle, not for anyone who saw me as less than human. Paul and Belle began their court-ordered programs, not out of love, not out of humility, but because they were finally forced to face the truth of who they had become. As for me, I did not forgive easily. Some things take more time than others. But each morning I woke to Paula's tiny footsteps and her whisper, "Nana, are you awake?" I felt something I had not felt in decades. Not victory, not vindication, peace. And sometimes, peace is the sweetest justice of all. After the verdict settled into place and the noise of Paul and Belle's outrage faded into the background of my memory, I decided Paula and I needed something different, something alive, something gentle, something that did not echo with old wounds. So a week after the hearing, I packed 2 small suitcases, bought snacks Paula liked, and booked us on a train heading west. Paula had never been on a long trip before. Her eyes widened at every whistle, every mountain curve, every stretch of open land we passed. She held my arm and whispered, "Nana, the world is big." "Yes," I told her softly, "bigger than any pain we leave behind." We spent 2 weeks drifting from place to place, quiet lakes, warm beaches, little towns with diners that smelled of cinnamon and coffee. Paula collected seashells and postcards. I collected moments where no one raised their voice. No one demanded anything. No one called me less than what I was. One evening, sitting on a pier in a coastal town where the sky melted into the water, Paula leaned against me and said, "Nana, can we live somewhere happy?" Her voice was so simple, so sure, that the decision made itself. I found a small house near the ocean, a place painted pale blue, with a garden waiting to be tended and windows that opened to the sound of waves instead of arguments. Far from Paul and Belle, far from the life that had worn me down grain by grain. When we moved in, Paula ran through the empty rooms laughing, her feet echoing on hardwood floors like a promise. I stood in the doorway and let the breeze wash over me, and for the first time in decades, I felt not like someone fleeing, but like someone arriving. A new life, a safe place, a home built not from survival, but from choice. If you have stayed with me through this whole story, thank you. These memories were not easy to reopen, but sometimes the truth needs light in order to heal. Paula and I built a new life far from the noise, far from the cruelty, far from the people who believed age made me weak. Out there by the ocean, I learned something precious. Peace is not given. Peace is chosen. And sometimes you choose it by walking away and refusing to return. So if my story touched you, reminded you of your own strength, or made you feel a little less alone in this big, complicated world, I hope you will stay with me for the next one. And my dear, if you want to keep hearing true stories from the quietest woman in the room, stories of survival, of betrayal, of love that refuses to die, then please subscribe to Grandma True Stories. Your support keeps these memories alive. Your presence keeps this old heart warm. I will be waiting for you on the next porch, with another truth I am finally ready to tell.